Okay. Hi, I'm Nathan. Unfortunately, George could not join us in person, but I think he's here on Zoom. Hey, George. So I'll be presenting our research from the past year or so, estimating demographic bias on tests of children's early vocabulary. So these are my cousins, Finn and Tessa. They are 3 and 5 and not reliably skilled at most everyday activities, but they do already speak and understand English remarkably well. Of course, what they know of the language is somewhat influenced by their environment. They live in Colorado in an outdoorsy family and of course spend a lot of time outside, and so already know more types of rocks and trees than I do. They have an impressive knowledge and vocabulary, but one that's based mostly on words that have to do with nature. In contrast, think about the types of words a child growing up in the city would be more likely to hear. Words like sidewalk, side scraper, apartment building, don't touch that dead pigeon, words like these. So imagine giving Finn and Tessa a test made up of nature words versus a test made up of city words. In one, I imagine they do quite well. In the other, they probably would not do so well. When making a vocabulary test, it's important to test general vocabulary ability and not specific vocabulary knowledge. So the point is, children's vocabulary generally grows quite quickly, but there is immense variability within that growth. Variability that reflects their linguistic and visual environments, as well as individual differences in aptitude, including potential language deficits, which means the test must aim to be quite general. So previous research has found that some demographic factors are often predictive of children's language skill, such as mother's education level. On the other hand, other studies have found stable and individual differences in children's language skill across 10 years of development, despite changes in maternal income and education. Today we're going to take a step back and ask whether or not these tests are fair, are they unbiased, or might the choice of words used to measure children's early vocabulary be making the test biased themselves. So let's look at the test we're looking at in question. The Communicative Development Inventory, or the CDI, is a collection of parent-reported surveys used to measure early vocabulary comprehension and production. The CDI includes a large checklist of several hundred children's vocabulary words like ball or apple, for which parents report whether or not the child understands or comprehends that word. The CDI is highly reliable and is proven to be predictive of later in life educational outcomes, and so as a result has been adapted to dozens of languages. These contributors from all over the world have helped create the Word Bank, which is a large database of close to 100,000 CDI administrations that is helping researchers use increasingly sophisticated psychometric models to test theories of early language learning. The CDI gives us a snapshot into the vocabulary of individual children at a particular moment in time. This plot shows the Word Bank data of individual children's vocabulary size by age, showing the immense variability in vocabulary size at any age. Even more importantly, it shows us the variability in vocabulary composition, even of two children with similar vocabulary sizes. If we zoom in on two children, who have similar size vocabularies at 20 months, we might see that both of these children know the word cat, but they may not have much other overlap in the words that they know. With the CDI, we can look at how many words children know at each age, or we can look at across children and get the average age of acquisition for each word. However, to do this kind of analysis, we pare down the amount of data. There we go. Our research focused on administrations of the test in American English on word production in children ages 16 to 30 months. However, we were limited by incomplete reporting of demographic data, as you can see by the numbers here. And we had to collapse across categories into dichotomous variables, in part due to the small number of observations in some of the categories, but also because binarizing the data makes our analysis a lot easier. However, we may be collapsing across interesting variation or potentially using suboptimal criteria to define our split. All right, now let's define our methodology. So IRT, or item response theory, measures both the ability of the child, theta, as well as the difficulty of each item, b sub I. In the case of the CDI, a child's ability is measured by the size of their vocabulary as well as the difficulty of the words within their vocabulary. The fewer kids that know a word, the harder the word should be, and so the more the ability of the child should increase if they know that word. Now, why is this a valuable or a useful way to measure ability? Well, you can't give Einstein a third grade math test and expect it to be a good measure of his math ability. The items would be too easy. He would get them all right, and hopefully so would I. And from that, you might assume that we are of the same math ability level, which obviously isn't true. He's a once-in-a-generation genius, and I'm, of course, better at math than he is. So you have to have a test that has a number of items of differing levels of difficulty so that you can do your analysis. If you look at this graph, modeling how items function based on IRT analysis, the first word might be a word like daddy, relatively easy to be known even at low language ability levels. And that third word might be a word like tomorrow, only likely to be known by kids of very high language ability level. So using these standard IRT models and mapping on the word bank data, we do actually find demographic differences. If you look here, if we see here on the left, female children generally show a mean advantage versus males across age. Children from higher educated mothers tend to have higher average language skill, and by race, white children tend to have higher average language skill than non-white children, according to parental report. Our question is, how do we determine the extent to which the items on the test might be producing these differences? To put it another way, could it be that the differences in mean language skill between demographic groups are due in part to the selection of items included on the CDI? Now, we'll ask this question using a more advanced IRT analysis that looks into whether individual words on the CDI function differently across demographic groups. This analysis is called differential item function, or diff, and it's the idea that some items may function differently for different groups. We consider a word to have diff if across all language levels, that word is more likely to be known by one group than another. But finding these differences is quite challenging. So you first need an accurate measurement of the language level of all your participants so that you can say with certainty that across all language levels, X item is easier for one group than another. However, and here's where it already starts to get tricky, to accurately get the ability level of your participants, you need a test that's a completely unbiased estimator of skill. To get an unbiased test, you need to identify those items that show diff, and you need to remove those items. But to find those items, you need to have the ability level of your participants. And to get the ability level, you need a test, and that test needs to be unbiased, and so you need ability level, and so on and so forth. And this little bit of circular logic is what we call the fundamental diff identification problem. And it's what has made our analysis so tricky, but also what has made it valuable. And to describe our findings, I'm going to pass things off to George, who should be on Zoom.
Thanks, Nathan. That's great. Let me just get my screen set up. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. Okay. And you can see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
All good.
Okay, great. So let's dive into the results of the diff analysis for sex. So for each item, we get two difficulties. For example, one for males and one for females for the item yesterday and for all of the other 680 items on the CDI. What we'll do is look at the distribution of the difficulty differences. So male minus female difficulty. And an unbiased test would have a symmetric distribution like this normal centered at 0. On average, no differences in item difficulty across demographic groups. But bias will show up if the distribution is skewed in one direction or the other, or has a mean shift away from 0. Also, we can look at the extrema, the particularly biased items that fall in the tails. And of course, maybe the tail of one side will be fatter than the other side. Okay. So here's the distribution of difference difficulties, difficulty differences for sex. And the median difficulty difference was 0.28, showing that the bulk of the items are easier for females than males. And zooming in at a small selection of the words, we can see these are the items that are more skewed toward being female biased, so more likely to be known by females than males. And at the bottom, we have the male biased words. And in the middle, you can see that even the sort of average items are somewhat biased towards, more likely to be known by females than males. Okay. For maternal education, the median difference is actually very close to 0. And half of the items are easier for high maternal education than low maternal education. And half of the items are also easier for low maternal education. So this is a fairly symmetric distribution. And here, zooming in, are some of the high ME biased items. Here are some of the low ME biased items. And in the middle, these are fairly symmetric. For race, the median difficulty difference was 0.4, with items being mostly easier for white than non-white children. And zooming in, here are some of the items that are biased for non-white children, and some of the items at the extreme for being biased for white children, according to parental report. And these are the median items. Okay, now let's figure out what to do. So we chose to evaluate multiple thresholds for pruning the extreme valued items from each distribution. So for each demographic factor, we pruned items with a between group difficulty difference from the mean difference at varying thresholds. So from 0.25 standard deviations outside the mean to half a standard deviation, 0.75, 1, all the way out to 3 standard deviations from the mean. So we're just pruning the tails, but we're looking up to very close to the mean difference of 0. So, of course, a potentially different subset of items are excluded for each model, but our goal is, of course, still to create a single CDI that is less biased on all of these 3 demographic dimensions. So we'll look at the size of demographic effects under each of these prunings. Ideally, of course, we'd find a threshold that minimizes the size of all 3 demographic effects. That is, gives us coefficient values of 0 in the regressions. So here are the coefficient values for each demographic and by the exclusion threshold on the x-axis. So let me orient you to say, well, there's not a single best threshold that minimizes demographic effects. Actually, what would be best is a very strict exclusion threshold of almost all of the items, 0.25 standard deviations, which would give you the smallest effect of maternal education, a fairly small one of race and of sex. Closer to 0 is up here. But that seems undesirable because we don't want to eliminate 90% of the CDI. So instead, we're going to try to prune a moderate number of items while giving moderate effects. So what we settled on is 2.25 standard deviations. The threshold prunes 59 extrema and reduces the SES and race-based disparities, and has sort of a median valued effect size of sex. So here are those 59 items. I'll just pause here and let you take a look. You can see that some are shared by both race and maternal education. So these were extreme on both of those dimensions. Vroom is also the single most biased item on the CDI. Good to know. And the bold items are the ones that are also 3 standard deviations. So they're extremely, extremely biased. So ideally, in the future, what we would want to do is actually figure out whether the input itself is biased. So are children in different demographic groups receiving different input, you know, like the city child versus the farm child. So what we did as a first step towards this is to look at Childis corpus of child-directed speech and look at the frequency of CDI words spoken directed to boys versus girls, which is the only demographic that's coded in Childis. We don't have any maternal education or race or ethnicity. And so basically, these are the words that are spoken more often to boys, and these are the ones spoken more often to girls. And you can see things are actually fairly symmetric. There is a little bit shift of, as we see in the overall results of the bias, but actually the correlation between the amount of diff and the log odds of being spoken to a female versus male child is fairly low. It is significant, but it's a very modest correlation. So in summary, accurate and unbiased measures of children's early vocab is important for researchers and clinicians. But of course, vocabulary checklists may have some items that favor one demographic group over another. And also these items may favor one group or another to a varying degree. So we need to measure both how many of these items are favoring each group and how much. And this may lead researchers to overestimate the size of demographic effects. But it's a bit of a chicken and an egg problem. So we need to look at how well input variation predicts this bias. And for now, what we can say is, well, we've identified as a first step some of the items that show extreme bias and that we may want to consider replacing on the CDI. So thank you for your attention, and thanks to collaborators on related projects.